Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
That's
Iranian state television confirming today that President Ibrahim Raisi has died.
Raisi was traveling in a helicopter with 8 others, including Iran's foreign minister, from the country's border with Azerbaijan. All on board were killed.
The crash happened in the early afternoon local time on Sunday, according to Iranian state TV.
It was in northwestern Iran, and the weather conditions hampered rescue efforts for hours.
This was a very mountainous, remote region. The fog, limited visibility to about 5 yards. I mean, just absolute pea soup.
That's Bloomberg's national security editor, Nick Wadhams.
And then you have this fact that the Iranian economy has been under U.S. and Western sanctions for so many years that makes it very difficult for them to get to buy new helicopters, to get spare parts.
The helicopter that Raisi flew in was a U.S.-manufactured Bell 212, a model that first entered service in 1968 and stopped being made in 1998.
I lived in Russia for 3 years in the 2000s. We were constantly writing stories about some of these Soviet-era helicopters that were falling from the sky. I mean, they were very unsafe.
Raisi's death comes at a delicate time for Iran. The country's government is facing increased levels of dissent and unpopularity over the state of the economy and its enforcement of strict dress codes for women.
He cracked down very heavily when there were protests related to Iran's treatment of women, for example, and that really didn't endear him to broader society in Iran either.
That's Rosalind Mathieson, who oversees coverage of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East for Bloomberg. Under Raisi, Iran has also had to navigate its role in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East.
Certainly, through him and the proxies that Iran controls in the region, we can see the pickups in tensions that happened with countries like Israel most recently with the conflict in Gaza.
While Roz says the next president is unlikely to radically transform Iran's foreign or domestic agenda, a leadership change could alter relationships across the Middle East.
Where it might become interesting, for example, is in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We've only just seen in the past year the moves to actually have diplomatic ties again between these two Middle Eastern powers. And it's very tentative still, pretty fragile. And does any change in leadership in Iran affect the course of that relationship, which would be very important, obviously, not just for the Middle East, but the rest of the world.
I'm David Gura.
And I'm Sarah Holder.
Today on The Big Take, what's next for Iran after the death of its president?
And what that means for a region already in turmoil. Roz, who was Ibrahim Raisi?
Well, he was president since the election a couple of years ago, and he came to power really because there weren't that many other candidates to take over in the election. And he was a long-standing official in Iran. He was relatively close to the supreme leader. He was someone who had enacted policies over the years. He was obviously also someone who was enmeshed really in the upper echelons of Iranian society, but he never had the level of broad political clout that some of his predecessors did. He didn't have that grassroots resonance with the public either, and that really troubled him in his leadership because he never quite had the backing of the public. Under Khamenei, he was really very much an enactor of his policies versus setting his own course. He did have that strong background, obviously, as an Islamist in society, but he didn't have that grassroots appeal.
And how would you characterize Raisi's time as president?
Well, he struggled in a number of ways. He came into power promising to fix the economy, which is, of course, a difficult ask when you've got an economy that's so heavily sanctioned. And he wasn't very successful in that regard. You can see in the way that the Iranian currency fell so heavily during his tenure. And the fact that ordinary Iranians didn't really feel that their lot became better. And so that led to some dissent that you could see show up in sporadic protests in Iran. And he was also very much a hardliner when it came to domestic dissent.
Given all this, how is the country reacting to his death?
Well, we can see that state media and semi-state media are displaying lots of signs of mass mourning going on. People out in the streets, gathering in squares, carrying his photograph, beating their chests. Footage showing that women are at mosques sobbing. Students at universities out en masse, distraught. But we do know that he wasn't very popular at home. And we can see small signs that people are displaying, in a way, a sense of celebration at the news of his death, particularly Iranians living overseas. There were reports that people were setting off fireworks to celebrate outside Iran, and certainly posting news celebrating his death. And inside Iran, Khamenei has declared 5 days of public mourning, so we can expect to see more of that. But you doubt that the majority of Iranians in the country are really that upset at this news.
Raisi is set to be succeeded by Vice President Mohammad Mokber, who will then organize an election to replace him within 50 days. Walk us through what these next 50 days might look like.
Well, the question is, does anyone else put their hand up to be a candidate? Again, ostensibly, these are elections and people can try and become a candidate, although there are a lot of very strict rules around eligibility that would probably rule many of them out. The question is, does the regime allow a sort of a reformist-like candidate to run in the election? Do they put their weight behind Mokber as the anointed one from the regime? Or do they allow a bit of a contest, at least to sort of show to the Iranian people that they do allow that competition to happen, and to encourage a bit more turnout than the last election, when the turnout was very, very low. But that has to be a careful exercise for the regime also, because very much they want a continuity person in there, and the continuity candidate to be the next president. The question again, is it Mokber or is it someone else?
And Raisi was also seen as a favorite to be next in line for Iran's supreme leader. What does his death and this election mean for succession planning now?
The biggest question is not so much the next couple of months in the election and who becomes president, because again, the ultimate power is really with the supreme leader. The question is, at what point does someone succeed the supreme leader? He is in his 80s. We know he does have some health challenges. And at some point, that broader succession question is going to come up. And as you say, Raisi was seen as someone who was going to be a contender for that. And the other person is Khamenei's son, Mujtaba, and he now stands alone as the most likely successor. That would be quite awkward, though, for Iran in some ways, because after the 1979 revolution in Iran, the idea of dynastic leadership, family members passing control to each other, really became seen as anathema, and something that successive leaders really touted as something they were opposed to. They do have to be generally a high-ranking Islamic cleric, which that would probably put Mokber, for example, out of contention for that. But that's really going to be the broader question in the end, because whoever is the supreme leader really is the person setting the ultimate agenda for Iran.
And if the supreme leader is setting that ultimate agenda, do you expect that this election for president will result in significant changes in leadership or policy?
Very much unlikely in terms of policy when it comes to Iran domestically, and in some measure unlikely to affect policy when it comes to some of the key foreign policy issues for Iran, most notably, again, the work of its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in the Red Sea, and certainly not the trajectory of the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. Where it might become interesting, for example, is in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We've only just seen in the past year the moves to actually have diplomatic ties again between these two Middle Eastern powers. And it's very tentative still, pretty fragile. And does any change in leadership in Iran affect the course of that relationship, which would be very important, obviously, not just for the Middle East, but the rest of the world? Does it also change the trajectory in any way when it comes to the US, and particularly the conversations that have been pretty well stalled around resuming the nuclear accord with the US? I mean, there's also the aspect of US politics and all of that with the presidential election coming up later this year, but there might be some changes there, obviously, policy-wise for the US. And those are probably the two biggest things to look out for.
After the break, my co-host David Gura and Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams discuss the wider implications of Raisi's death for the region and the rest of the international community.
The death of President Raisi raises some critical questions about the path forward for Iran's allies and its adversaries. Well, that's something National Security Editor Nick Wadhams has been looking into, what the president's death means outside of Iran. So, Nick, how involved was President Raisi in Iran's international affairs?
It's actually a great question because so much of Iranian leadership is pretty opaque in the decision-making structure. What is clear is that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, really calls all the shots. The president can be a moderating or a sort of quickening factor in that. Some of his predecessors, for example, had been a little more moderate, had pushed for opening with the international community. But what was clear in this case was that Ibrahim Raisi was really doubling down on the supreme leader's edict toward a more of a hardline stance.
Nick, you and I last spoke last month after that unprecedented attack that Iran launched on Israel. Any sense, with now a month plus hindsight, how involved the president was in planning that and the execution of that?
That's not something really that would have run through his office in terms of the detailed planning and execution. I mean, he would have certainly signed off on it, and it would not have gone ahead had he not supported it. But in its current form, the Iranian government is really pretty streamlined. This is not a situation where the Iranian leadership gets into the Situation Room and really thrashes out thorny issues. The course has pretty much been set for several years now. It was quite clear that Iran had to respond to Israel, that they felt compelled to respond, and the debate would have only been in the details, but not in the broader strategy.
Nick, in the Middle East, there's been this fragile détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and now there's this fresh concern about what'll happen to that relationship.
There's so many questions around what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia because the Saudi king himself is ailing, is extremely frail, and so we're waiting to see what's happening there. I think that's going to be a situation where you see things essentially put on hold. What's clear is that Saudi Arabia and Iran had wanted some sort of off-ramp and were pushing in that direction where they did not have to be so confrontational to one another. But again, the Israel situation complicates things so much because Saudi Arabia had been very delicately nosing around this issue of normalization with Israel. In fact, normalization had seemed like it was essentially going to become a reality before October 7th happened. After that, it became much more distant, but there had been these conversations between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia on normalization. The big question now, though, is if those talks are tentatively starting to resume again, as it does appear, what does that mean for Saudi Arabia and Iran? And it would appear that the more Saudi Arabia pushes towards some form of normalization with Israel, the less chance it's going to have toward a broader rapprochement with Iran.
When you look at which world leaders have expressed their condolences, I see President Putin, Prime Minister Modi of India. What does that tell you about the role that President Raisi played on the world stage?
Well, the U.S. has pushed Iran for so long and pushed other countries to stay away from Iran. They've sanctioned Iran. They've sanctioned companies that did business with Iran. And the result of that has been this really fascinating fracturing of the global economy, where countries that the U.S. has essentially expelled from its own economy, like Russia, and to some degree with China, have really made common cause together and have found that if they do business with one another, they don't necessarily even need the United States. So Russia and Iran have in some ways gotten much closer. Iran has supplied Russia with drones for the Ukraine war. India is really a fascinating case because it's very much taken a much more non-aligned approach where it's decided, hey, we are not going to pick sides. And so you really see the limits of U.S. leverage overseas where you have a country the U.S. wants to make common cause with in India, and India is simply saying, no, we're going to keep up our relations. We're going to keep in touch. And it's really shown a great test for the United States. President Biden threw a state dinner for Prime Minister Modi. And he's just saying, no, we're going to keep our own foreign relations. We're going to keep contact with Iran, and there's nothing you can do about it.
On Monday afternoon, White House advisor John Kirby addressed President Raisi's death during a press briefing.
President Raisi was responsible for atrocious human rights in his own country, the arrest and the physical violence against hundreds of protesters. No question, this was a man who had a lot of blood on his hands. That said, as we in any other case, we certainly regret in general the loss of life and offered official condolences as appropriate.
Nick, there are the geopolitical implications, and then there's the economic and the market fallout. There wasn't much market movement right after this crash, and I wonder what your sense is of how President Raisi's death could affect the global oil market.
So I think the message you're seeing there is a sense that for all of the political upheaval and the questions people have around that death and the surprise, the shock of the Iranian president being killed in this helicopter crash, there is not actually an expectation that it would lead to major policy changes in Iran, given the dominance of the supreme leader, the control he has over Iran's direction. The belief is that actually Iran will not make significant changes in terms of its energy policies, in terms of its political policies, its policies on the national security front. And you see the same with Saudi Arabia. The king's health has been failing for some time. The crown prince has so much control. The feeling is that actually these changes, which seem from the outside like major upheaval, will not actually change the course of travel for either of those countries all that much.
So there's going to be an election in the coming months. Iran's supreme leader made that announcement on Monday. He also said there's going to be a period of mourning. What is the international community going to be watching for until that election?
A couple things that will be really interesting to track. One is, what will Iran's stance be toward the international community? So is this a possibility, remote as it may seem now, for some sort of rapprochement with the West? Is there an opening here to continue some of the back-channel conversations toward potentially easing concerns around Iran's nuclear program? Is there a window here where you could seize this moment and say, okay, we can come to some sort of agreement? Or will it be just exactly the opposite, a moment where Iran will not want to let its adversaries, such as the U.S. and Israel, exploit a period that may be seen as a period of real instability and vulnerability, and they're just going to double down and clam up and not have any interaction with the outside world? Those interactions and those diplomatic conversations tend to happen in secrecy anyhow, so they can be tough to track. But what we're really looking for right now is there going to be a sort of bunker mentality in Iran where all contact essentially with the outside world is cut until they get through these elections? Or do we see a moment where there actually is some outreach and conversation that could lead to an easing of tensions in the future?
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura.
And I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by David Fox, Thomas Liu, Julia Press, and Adriana Tapia, who also fact-checked this episode. It was mixed by Blake Maples.
Our senior producers are Kim Gittleson and Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer, and she edited this episode. Sage Bauman is our head of podcasts.
Thanks so much for listening. Please follow and review The Big Take wherever you get your podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. We'll be back tomorrow.